Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. As you may be able to tell from my voice, I've just gotten back from vacation, but couldn't resist recording a podcast on vacation. And my guest for this episode is Tatenda Musapatike. She is the founder and CEO of the Voter Formation Project, which is a nonprofit seeking to register and mobilize American voters from underrepresented communities through digital ad programs. So here we're talking about how to use digital ads to register and mobilize Black voters and voters from Latinx communities. Now, the Voter Formation Project spins out of Tatenda's work as Senior Director for Campaigns at Acronym, where she led the Expand the Electorate project, where a lot of the tactics that we're going to discuss in this episode were put into practice in the 2020 election. And there's a great case study and white paper that outlines what we're going to discuss in detail, and I'll link to that in the episode description. So in a sense, this episode is meant to kind of introduce you to that study and the results that Tatenda and her team found using digital ad programs in the 2020 election, much in the same way that we discussed in episode 120 with Nick Ahmed working with Priorities USA. But the focus here, again, is particularly on underrepresented voters. And Tatenda has also worked as a client solutions manager for Facebook. So she has a real in-depth understanding of how data acquisition and targeting techniques work. And as we'll discuss in the episode, some of the systematic biases, both in data and targeting technology, in reaching voters from underrepresented communities, particularly non-white voters. So in both of these cases, we have a series of randomized controlled trials trying to suss out the effectiveness of digital ads on mobilization. And in Tatenda's work in the Expand the Electorate project, there were variations in the content type of the message, so like an information message and an empowerment message. But what's interesting is that these messages were issued from different organizational accounts, one mimicking a formal Get Out the Vote account and another more culturally sensitive, youth, edgy, you could say, brand called the People's Power Grab. And again, I really encourage you, especially if you're working on this stuff actively, to check out those white papers because the motivations are very clear, the methods are very well detailed, and the results are presented very transparently. And although it's not exactly academic research, we're looking at treatments and randomized field experiments in the context of a real campaign with quite large budgets. So the Expand the Electorate project had about $12.5 million in trying to mobilize and register voters from underrepresented communities. So that's what this episode is all going to be about. We're going to dive into some of the results from the Expand the Electorate project and talk about how some of the challenges Tatenda and her team identified there at Acronym are going to be attempted to be overcome in the Voter Formation Project. And so last thing before we get into the episode, I recorded this at home in New Orleans on the microphone I used to use for the podcast in not the best recording environment. So it may sound a little bit different. And also I think there's a garbage truck or something in the beginning from Tatenda's input. So a few audio externalities, but all in all, I think it's a great episode. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Tatenda Musapatike. Again, she is the founder and CEO of the Voter Formation Project. Tatenda, thanks for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So to start out here, could you give us a bit of a backstory into the Voter Formation Project and the type of work you're doing to register and mobilize voters from underrepresented communities?
Sure. The Voter Formation Project was founded late last year, and it was designed to try and use digital marketing tactics, so think digital advertising influencer campaigns, in order to help bring more Black and Brown voters into the voting process and to increase civic participation among this audience. We know that people of color tend to spend more time online compared to their older and whiter counterparts. And so we wanted to make sure that we were fully utilizing the complete suite of online tactics that we could be using to help increase the electorate, which is something that currently isn't solely done by an organization or the sole focus of an organization.
Got you. And I know this project comes out of earlier work you've done at Acronym through the Expand the Electorate project, which sought to increase participation among Black and Latinx voters during the 2020 election in 8 target states. So let's dive into that initiative. The Expand the Electorate project outlines a number of key challenges in turning out minority voters, such as voting laws and a lack of research into targeted ads. The project also notes that non-white audiences are difficult to target online due to structural racism in data and technology. What type of biases exist in ad targeting technology, and how does this affect voter outreach to people of color?
Oh, so many. So I think to give a little bit of background, I have been doing this kind of work. So online marketing essentially for politics for over a decade. And in the time that I have been doing this work, I have worked at nonprofits, consultancies, technology companies. And so I've really gotten to see the full spectrum of how it is that different organizations use online marketing for different initiatives, whether it be fundraising for their organization, whether it be trying to increase the electorate, whether it be persuading people to vote for their candidate. But through all of these different types of campaigns, voter registration and mobilization campaigns, I think fascinate me the most because they allow for you to really utilize the entire marketing funnel in a smart way. However, I was the client solutions manager at Facebook for almost 4 years, working with left leaning nonprofits and super PACs in order to help them with their strategies on the platform. And I noticed that from the time that before I was at Facebook and at a consultancy doing this type of ad work, like literally buying the ads and building the strategies, all the way through the time I left Facebook, I had not seen any innovation in how folks were doing these types of campaigns. I felt like I had seen the same types of creative, the same types of buying for actually 6 years. And it frustrated me because the internet changed dramatically in that time. We went from predominantly desktop users to predominantly mobile users. And we saw people increasing the time spent from browsing the internet and websites to being into logged in social media services. We saw people transition from consuming mostly photos to mostly videos. And so it boggled my mind that we were still seeing these same types of static image ads telling people to vote at the last minute. And so that's kind of a contextual focus on like how the internet has changed over the time that I've been doing this work and up until now to help kind of contextualize your question, right? And so being that there are so many different ways now that you can reach people on the internet. Before it really was, you were on your desktop. Most people, privileged people, had one desktop in their home if they could, and they were logging into the same browser. And that browser identified, what kind of websites you were on due to these things called cookies. And so you kind of had a really stagnant idea of how it is you were to reach people. You could go to different sites and try and collect, put your advertisements on sites you thought that people who you were trying to target were going to. But in that period of time, I would say this is like 2000s to present, a lot has changed. Now there are all these ways that we can target people based on a number of factors. One, platforms where people are spending their time. So we're all familiar with all of the social media sites. Many of them provide different ways that you can target people. And so we can just use a Facebook as an example, but Facebook is a logged in service. And when you log in, people know a lot about you. But platforms don't ask for race, which is both good and bad. You can imagine not necessarily wanting to tell this company what race you are, lest they use it for nefarious purposes. But a lot of the people who built most of these social media platforms were white men. I think it's no secret that many of the online companies have had very public reckonings with the fact that their companies, especially in their engineering departments, do not tend to employ, one, women. That's changing over time. And then two, people of color, especially people of color from underrepresented minorities. So you then have a system by which people are developing a technology, but are wholesale excluding people from many communities for which they're trying to target. So this can lead to basically I would almost like to say, white assumed targeting mechanism, where if you're reaching folks, the machines, frankly, due to our own internal biases of who built them, are going to compile audiences of mostly white users. it's really fascinating because when you do this work for a long time, you realize it is really hard to build targeting segments where the returns that you are getting back are for overwhelming majority people of color audiences. It is hard to run programs where you will target even things like BET or Black hair care products. And even then, you will still find that you might be getting audiences that are still over 30% white. And so, in that aspect, the unconscious bias of the folks who built the algorithms comes to surface. And I would say that I think a lot of companies are trying to correct for this, right? Like there are many initiatives to bring in more people of color to help build products. But whenever you have products built by singular teams of folks who fill the same demographic, you should always be wary of how the unintended impacts of race may come to light in the product use, or I would say application of use of the thing that's built. The other piece where systemic racism comes into play is data. And so a lot of our data lists and data infrastructure are based on financial transactions. So think home purchases, think people who are banked, people who have credit, people who make purchases on debit cards, right? These are all ways that data companies can collect and aggregate information about who you are. So if you are a homeowner, that is public information. People will know, again, because of your home loan, how much it was when you were making when you purchased, or they can at least estimate how much you pay a month in mortgage, connect that with your credit card data, which is not publicly available, but often exchanged in these data aggregators or data companies. And so what you find is that historically, people of color did not have access to purchase homes for as long of a time. People of color are less likely to get lines of credit. They are, on average, less likely to be given large amounts of credit, and oftentimes are underbanked compared to their white counterparts. So you end up with a system where you're trying to target people and find people based on available data, but you're missing chunks of the population because they have been excluded deliberately from the same type of economic activity as their white counterparts because of racism. So that's all kind of how this comes to play.
I hadn't thought about this. It's sort of a two-pronged challenge. On the one hand, you have the actual delivery of the ads, but then on the other, you have these commercial data vendors that, I'm sure there are some biases built into that, but then also to use that data and actually effectively target underrepresented groups seems like it's quite a challenge.
It is. And it's funny, the more I do the work, you will stumble across different challenges where even if you're targeting segments and the systems will say they are optimizing for people who clicked and converted on your ads, but you're still somehow seeing that you're getting a 60% return on mostly white people coming through your ads, only to come and find that your ads, are being delivered to people who will click more, maybe carried over more than like the initial interest segment. So it's just very fascinating to see the results of what it means to try and target an audience and then validate that as you go, and just realize that this is really hard. And especially if you're trying to reach unregistered people, it gets even more difficult because we have lists of registered people, but none of those lists include online identifiers such as email and mobile phone. So that makes it harder to take this offline data that we have that's fairly accurate of registered voters and then maybe suppress that list from your targeting audience. So it all just compounds thing after thing from offline to online. And then once you're online trying to reach those folks, it's harder than I think people really give it credit for.
Right. So both on the input and output side, you're having issues with measurement. And I'm sure we'll get to that as we go through the episode here. But let's talk about the voter outreach initiatives that you worked on in 2020 as part of the Expand the Electorate project. And you tested various message types coming from differently styled brand accounts. And before we get into that, I think it's a crucial point that all of the ad variants you tested led to the same funnel, which was the acronym Citizen Tech Stack. So could you describe acronym Citizen for us in terms of its role both as a navigation guide for citizens, but also as a valuable data collection tool for the project?
Sure. So acronym Citizen was the tool that we built in order to try and build the most data-driven program possible. Acronym Citizen is now called Formation, as it lives with the Voter Formation Project. The goal of this website for external users was to try and make it as easy and seamless as possible for people to register and then make a plan to vote. So people could come to the site, they could check to see if they were registered. If they were registered, we automatically funneled them into a different user flow for them to make a plan to vote. We worked closely with a company called Ballot Ready, where that flow would then allow people to say where they were, and they could get personalized information on how they could vote, where they could vote based on their location, which for many of your listeners should know, how you can vote is very dependent on where you live, even within a state. So that was exciting. And then within that, people could make a plan and then get email or text or both kinds of reminders as the dates for their plan were approaching. And that plan was completely designed by them to fit, their needs, because especially last cycle, some people would have preferred to vote by mail. Some people, like my father, refused to vote by mail and wanted to go to vote on election day, as they always did. And so people could make those own decisions for them, but still have a customized plan and customized reminders. If you were not registered to vote, we then would direct you to your Secretary of State website. That way you could land on the experience where you could then register officially with your state online. And if you couldn't register online in your state, we provided you with the paperwork and instructions on how you could register there. So for the user, it was a very seamless and I would think intuitive user experience to come and figure out how it is that you could participate in the election. What makes it different is that on our back end, we did a lot of robust tracking that doesn't actually exist with a number of tools available. And so we, and this may sound scary to some users, but we were able to track aggregate user actions across most of the site. And so we would know what types of ads were generating the most landing page views. We knew what types of ads were generating the most conversions. If someone came to the site and dropped off, we were able to retarget them with ads to push them to complete the experience. And this just allowed us to make a lot of really smart decisions in terms of optimization of our ads programs. We were able to know what messages were working, what brand treatments were working, what creative treatments within the brand treatments were working the best for what we were trying to do. And then we were able to assign costs to every single action that we're taking within the website. So it just gave us a level of sophistication, frankly, that commercial marketers have had for years in order for us to make the same types of decisions we would be able to make if we were commercial marketers, only for civic engagement purposes.
Right. It's kind of like if you were tracking when people put things in their cart but didn't, complete a purchase, you're taking this into the voter registration and mobilization space.
Exactly. The example I like to use often is that we wanted to be the pair of shoes that you were left in your shopping cart that followed you around the internet until you decided to buy them.
Right. And I mean, I think that retargeting piece is key. When people start filling out a form and then don't, you retarget them, or you would share a list of those users with an organization that could also follow up with them. And I'm curious about those digital partnerships because on the one hand, I think that, the data sharing and the cross-organizational outreach helps the overall project mission, but I'm curious to whether that kind of devolves insight about, what's happening. Because on the one hand, you're funneling people with your ads to their, local Secretary of State site to sign up and get registered. But to retarget them, sometimes you're sending them to a partner organization in that state to target them. So could you talk a little bit about those digital partnerships and particularly how sharing that data and sort of, working together to get people registered and mobilized, what impact did that have, particularly on the type of measurements for the study you're doing? Does sharing that data and having different organizations target those voters, is there a trade-off between doing that and the type of insights that you're keeping in-house, or did the acronym Citizen platform continue to track those results?
Yeah, so I think it was only for the better and for several reasons. So I think there's a huge push and pull here for a lot of organizations want to keep all of their data fully in-house because they want to be able to measure the efficacy of their programs fully. And in many cases, it's almost a donor ecosystem driven behavior whereby everyone wants to measure the cost per voter or cost per net voter by tactic. And so I think there is a culture where people want to say digital does only this, and voter outreach and field does only this, and mail does only this. But what we know is that when you reach people with different modes of communication, they're more likely to take actions, and you actually tend to find efficiencies. And so, if you have an organization like ours that does digital really well, and I think we're the best at it, and you go to an organization that does field really well, and they are the best at it. And let me be clear, I do not do field work. It is the Lord's work, and I just don't have those skill sets. Then, how is it that we are not finding efficiency through pairing these two methods? Another thing to keep in mind is that once someone goes to the Secretary of State, we find a lot of drop off. It is very hard to find efficiency within those systems because, for safety and security reasons, most states are not giving folks like me or technological entrepreneurs the ability to build technology on their systems or to be able to utilize their systems to do any kind of tracking or measurement. So we call it the leaky funnel. You can drive a high number of people to a Secretary of State website, but once you do that, you need to expect a lot of drop off. If you are seeing 30-40%, you are doing really well in terms of drop off of people who complete the registration. So we're already dealing with a fairly opaque system. And I wanted to think through what are ways that haven't really been explored that we can close this leaky funnel with taking actions that we know are smart. And what we know is smart is layering communication. So I know everyone who my website has pushed to the Secretary of State website. Why would I not share that information with a field group that is the best at what they do and can talk to people one-on-one with those data sets to encourage them to finish the action, especially given that at this point, I'm just hoping and praying that my retargeting of ads gets more people to finish, when really what we could be doing is increasing the efficiency of both my work because, I will have someone following up with people going to the Secretary of State's website, and the efficiency of the field groups who know they are talking to pre-qualified people who are interested in registering to vote. I think it's only a win-win. And it's just a matter of exploring how exactly we can find the most efficiencies from these types of partnerships, because there are so many groups that maybe aren't connecting their field plus digital programs for a variety of reasons, but chief among them being understanding cost of each individual tactic, or many groups who aren't able to do digital well, or groups that do digital well but maybe don't have the strongest field programs. It just makes sense to close this kind of siloed nature of both of these so that both types of outreach can help each other.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And let's bring things back in-house to the digital side, where we'll get into the content of the ads themselves that you were sending people during the 2020 election. And you had various message types, and we've talked about this on the show before, like an information message, an empowerment message. So you're testing the variance on the content, but you also issued them from two different types of accounts. One was a official looking get out the vote account, and another more modern brand called the People's Power Grab. So can you describe the thinking behind issuing ads from differently branded accounts?
Yes. So there is a conventionally held wisdom, I would say, and it's based mostly on mail outreach and some digital work that says that official looking creative, meaning brands or treatments that look like they could have come from a government, meaning official, are more likely to move or help people consider to register to vote or vote. So if people receive mailers that look like it could have been sent from the government, there have been studies that have shown that people are more likely to respond to that type of treatment than any other kind of treatment. There are fewer studies that show that this works for online treatments, and even fewer studies that show that this works for people of color. I don't like rules when I feel like there isn't enough data behind why that rule should exist. And I'm not just a user of the internet, but a person who studies how people are consuming on the internet. And it did not make sense to me that we would be talking to all segments of online users the same way, that we would assume that only official looking creative online could work best for this type of work, when we hadn't explored how we could be using video, how we could be better using mobile, how we could be using influencers to drive, especially younger people of color, to vote, knowing that they spend a lot of their time consuming online mobile video content. And so we created a brand that was designed to feel young, contemporary, but also welcoming and inviting, edgy, but non judgmental, to try and build pro voting and voting is good type content for people who may gravitate more towards that. And it took us a while to build this brand. Like in political world, if you're taking a month to build a brand, that's a really long time. I think there are folks who do work similar to me who, when I say, "Oh yeah, we took a month to develop this brand," they look at me like I am insane. But I think strong creative work takes time, and it's oftentimes worth it. And I think in this case it was, because we uncovered through this work that the initial supposition was correct. On the official looking creative does not work for everyone online. It can't work for everyone online. And we found that the treatments that came from our more modern brand work best with young people. They worked best on Snapchat and YouTube, whereas the official looking creative tended to work better with the older segments of our audience. So think 45 plus on Facebook. And that just only drove home the point for us that we need to stop assuming that there is, one, a best practice for creative in this work, and two, that best practice can work for everyone. The online is a very fragmented media consumption environment, and the groups that we're targeting are not a monolith. And so we need to be thinking about, instead of what works for everyone, what works for who. And that's how you're able to find the best efficiencies through your programming, is understanding the different segments of your audience and how you're best able to move them.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of distinction, actually. We're just talking about these Secretary of State websites, being kind of a leaky funnel, because they are these kind of clunky, very official looking websites where people drop off when they go to them. But there is an assumption that more official looking ads will drive more traffic in this political space. So on the one hand, you can use official looking content to try to get people to the very official and clunky website where people drop off. So I think, designing a different style more suited to a younger audience is super smart. And I'm curious about the design process. You mentioned that, designing a political brand took a month, and that's a very long time in this space. But, what's the kind of design process when thinking about how to communicate something, relatively unsexy like voter registration and voting to specific communities? How do you think about what will resonate with a particular community, especially those that are underrepresented in the voting process?
Yeah, I would say the traditional way would be to look at the polling that's available and then try and figure out what message might work best. But we took a lot more qualitative approach. And again, this is where I think the way that I approach this is different than many in the space. If you're going to do this kind of work, I think it means doing it with integrity and doing it correctly, which means that may take more time and it takes more money. And that means, in doing it correctly, getting to know this audience and doing whatever it is that you can to try and get a lot of qualitative information that you can convey to a creative team that's also really committed to getting it right. A diverse, meaning not just in race, but in age and experience, creative team who really cares about the work and wants to get it right and is willing to dive into that research with you. And so I was lucky to have such a wonderful team at Acronym that helped us do this, where we did not just look at polling. In fact, polling was like the last thing we looked at. But we talked to a lot of community groups, and I asked them, hey, you do work in these communities day in and day out. What is it that your people who are in the field are saying folks care about? What is it that they're encountering that people want to talk to them about as to why it is that they do or do not vote? We were able to commission a study that was different. It was a qualitative study where we had folks dig in and talk about, why is it that they weren't registered? How did they envision the process of registering? What did they compare it to? How did it make them feel? And we compared that against people who were registered and people who were new registrants who were Latinas, which was really fascinating to hear people really dive into how did they describe the process of voting. And an overwhelming theme is that people described it as a journey, like they were on a highway and they wanted to make individual decisions for themselves, which really helped us. We had people select images that resonated with how they felt going through this journey. And oftentimes it was like woods or forests or highways, which was really fascinating. And then we did a lot of work into what are people in these audiences consuming online. We went to a lot of the online vendors who were running webinars and had information on this is how we are seeing folks from these different communities consume media on our platforms. And we use that to kind of build out these brands and then many of the creative and influencer treatments. One of the key decisions that came out of that is that influencer content and TikTok style content was really popular with some of our younger audiences. And so we had a person on our team essentially become an influencer and do a lot of the viral challenges, some of which were very funny thinking back to remember them, to talk about voting or creating like, day in the life, quick 15-second, like hop out of bed, like time to go vote type content. And so just taking the time to really try and learn about these audiences and how they would describe their own experiences, I think was just key to doing this kind of content well.
Yeah, I mean, just listening to you talk about it, designing the brand, getting these qualitative insights. I mean, it's a huge amount of effort that's put into it. And I know, at least initially, you started out with this huge cross-platform media strategy to really test, mainstream social media platforms, but also kind of less popular or common platforms that we think for political advertising, like Snapchat, Quora, and Outbrain. So can you describe a bit the cross-platform media strategy and where did ads seem to perform better in terms of getting people to take the actions set up through Acronym Citizen?
Yeah, the mandate was try it all. I if we can somehow do a test on there, let me know. And I don't want to hear we shouldn't or can't. We should just try anything, even if it seems counterintuitive. In the end, though, the platforms that ended up, I would say, working the best were the ones that folks mostly use. There weren't any sleeper platforms. I guess you could count Snapchat maybe as a sleeper platform. And YouTube surprised us as well for conversions. I think people mostly think of YouTube as a persuasion or middle of the funnel type placement because they do short and long form video. But you actually can get conversions on YouTube. It's just a matter of the style of the content that you use. So none of the the Outbrains and the Next Doors of the world did not work out so well for us. But we did see a lot of success with your Facebooks, Instagrams, YouTube, Snapchat, and we did a lot of audio towards the end as well, which I think also had its benefits. Harder to measure, but I still think it was useful for us to raise awareness with audio as well. Because again, I don't think we know enough to say that there are full best practices for how to do this work, especially in an environment like online digital marketing that is constantly evolving and changing. And so I think once we lose our curiosity or ability to say, let's test something, it's when we start losing the race in how to do this well. And so I think every cycle will be exploring, what new platforms should we try? Should we revisit some of these platforms, even if they didn't work well before, just to understand if that's still the case? Because again, people's consumption is constantly changing and we can't really make any assumptions about what is going to work with a certain subsect of people. We can make inferences and judgments based on past data, but it always makes sense, especially if you have new information about how people are using online or if a platform itself has dramatically changed, how you should be considering using it, especially when you're scaling to millions of dollars on platforms.
Right. And I think Snapchat in this case is a good example, which, was kind of hot in 2016 as an emerging platform, but really couldn't give campaigns the data they were looking for and, maybe kind of discounted. But I think your study shows that there is some, viability there for political ads. But let's get to the results of the program, which we've talked about, these difficulties both in delivering the ads effectively, but also in terms of measuring and quantifying the effect of these ads. But nevertheless, you find that the overall effects of the program were directionally positive, but statistically insignificant in both registering and mobilizing the target groups. So how do you interpret these overall findings, especially in light of some of these measurement challenges we've been discussing?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. It's complicated. I think if you're looking at the aggregate group of folks, directionally positive but statistically insignificant, first off, doesn't mean it didn't work. It means that we have more work to do because in my estimation, when you're doing this work, doesn't work means statistically significant in the wrong direction. So we then looked at our results and said, did this work really well for a certain subsect of people? And the answer is yes. African American women in particular responded very strongly to our mobilization programs and to our registration programs. Why I think we weren't able to find statistical significance is because we were not able to move African American men and Latinas with the same volume as we were African American women. So that says to me that we needed to do more work in figuring out what works for who better, right? We started off with that assumption, but the results, if anything, said to us, we need to dial in even more on how it is that we can start to see the gains that we saw with African American women, with African American men and Latinas. And Latinas in particular, this is where I would say what we did not work, in that in Southwest communities, we saw statistical significance in the opposite direction, meaning the ads that we ran for Southwest Latinas did not work in this instance, but they did work with East Coast Latinas, which again gives us a lot of room to start to think, what could we have done differently? I think a big thing we could have done differently is Spanish language. I think something we could have done more strongly is running more treatments with cultural relevance to make those ads seem a bit more personalized to those communities, because we ran Spanish only and we ran the same Latina treatments across states. I don't think we should do that anymore. And so there's a lot more research to be done about what messages move certain sub communities, is the overall takeaway that I have from this research, and not saying, digital doesn't work or it can't work. I don't think that's true. I think it's that we need to figure out how best it can work and in what circumstances it works best in order for us to drive significance and then also drive results. And so I think this is where I may differ from a lot of the folks in the academic community on this. But because digital is very hard to measure, it's hard to measure because we do not know the full impacts of our study, because while we had a holdout group and a treatment group, we did not design our program around specifically driving media to our treatment group. I found that when you do this, it's really hard because your treatment groups are often really small. You have to change the way you buy. And when you change the way you buy for measurement, it changes the way that you run your program overall. Like, it is very hard for you to recreate the buying conditions that you do in a test for a real world environment. So what I was not going to do was to alter how I would run program for a real world environment for the sake of measurement, which meant that the results that we had in our testing were not the most concentrated results. If anything, what we were reporting was the least possible effect and not the actual effect of the media on folks. Because again, we did not specifically target all of our dollars of media to directly the target group based on a one-to-one match rate. Again, the lists of the unregistered, as we talked about earlier, are not the best for reaching our target audiences. And so we used a variety of targeting methods that were applied to millions and millions of voters, as opposed to the tens of thousands of voters who were in our treatment group. So all this to say, yes, the results were statistically insignificant, but directionally positive, but that's the least possible effect, meaning that there's a lot left on the table that probably was impactful that we just cannot measure. And we could talk about digital measurement all day. It's so difficult. It's really hard. And the platforms that allow you to measure or allow you to do really strong measurement basically don't allow political advertisers to do that anymore. So we're just in a very frustrating mix of how is it that you build programs and get actionable, accurate measurement that can get the full impact of a program. It's difficult.
Right. And that's a whole nother podcast, the difference between the kind of academic measurement. And I mean, I think one of the really cool things about these type of studies, and they're very useful, I think, for academics, is that, you are testing these in real world environments under campaign conditions, that context of the campaign, especially in an election as polarizing as the previous one. I mean, these are things that, okay, maybe you can, juice up a statistically significant result in a controlled environment with, a over the top treatment, but it's not simulating, or it's trying to simulate a real world effect, but it's not being done under the contextual conditions of the race. And so it's two totally different things, and both have their trade-offs. But I'm curious as to how you interpret this gender difference between Black women and Black men. I think one of the clearest results is that these treatments, these digital ads worked really well for Black women, especially those over 35, but they didn't seem to work for Black men. And so I'm just curious, do you have an explanation for that gender difference, and how are you approaching these gender differences going forward?
Yeah, we just need to do a lot more partnership and work with groups that focus on Black men. I think that's step one. It's interesting. When I got these results, I sat back and was like, is my bias as an African American woman at 33 impacting the success? And then I looked back at our creative, and a lot of our influencer who did a lot of the work was a Black woman. We certainly had Latina influencers and Latinx men influencer type creative as well, but I think our strongest was African American women. And so part of it, I really had to investigate my own bias in how we manage creative production and make sure that we're counteracting that. But I also just think that, there is a cultural difference that exists between Black men and Black women. I think it's why you see a difference in how many Black men voted for Trump versus Black women, right? Like, these two groups are not, again, a monolith. They think differently. There are different considerations, there are different cultural considerations to be made. And so, if anything, we've learned that we need to have unique treatments for both types of people. And I think it requires more work and more, frankly, investment and research across the board, not just for our program, but in understanding how is it that we can motivate and persuade Black men, because it's not the same thing. And we aren't going to be successful at motivating and turning out Black people if we are saying that all of these different Black folks should get the same message. It's just not true. We've seen enough voting behavior and just, studies like mine that show that there's a difference to know better. And so beginning to find Black men to start to lead on this work and get investment to do this work and be fully resourced to do this kind of research and outreach would be the best start. But I don't know how many folks listen to your podcast who are funders or in this ecosystem.
Yeah. Speaking of measurement issues, it's also difficult to see not just how many people are listening, but also who is listening. I wanted to ask you about, another interesting aspect, which is the overall cost for conversion. And when I was reading the study, it differs between how you measure different groups. And it seems like it's actually kind of just a rough approximation for, how much did it cost to register and, get an actual completion on these forms for each voter. But it, depending on how you measure it, in some cases, it can be, hundreds of dollars in order to get just one person registered. And then you're not sure if they actually vote or not. So I'm curious to ask you about that. And, how are you approaching driving costs down through the voter formation project?
Yeah, it's in this instance, I think it's part art and part science. One of the biggest things that helps drive down costs is scale. So when we look at online conversion campaigns writ large against all types of folks who do them, the number one thing that you can do to try and drive down conversions is to find scale in your audience, meaning growing it. As we've talked about earlier, for a variety of reasons, growing audiences of predominantly people of color who take conversions is hard. Honestly, if I wanted to drive down my cost per conversion, the easiest thing I could do would be to include white people, and I would be sailing. It would be the easiest thing. I could do it in my sleep. But that's not what we're trying to do. So you have a mixture of, one, trying to figure out what types of targeting, but also data levers can we pull to try and find more scale, yet stay true to driving the most honest audience that we can based on our goals. And then creative also plays a huge, huge part in this. A lot of creative testing to figure out, again, what messages are working online for conversions for these audiences. I think a lot of times when practitioners approach conversion work, because a lot of us are very data-driven folks, we look at what can we do in the platforms to try and make this better or more efficient without really analyzing the elephant in the room, which is what are the treatments you're showing people to start with. And so that's going to be another thing that we need to tackle is, I think, more conversion experimentation in terms of the actual visuals or videos that we are using to drive conversions. As I say that, I'm also going to note that while it is great that we all care about internet privacy now, and that many platforms and hardware manufacturers and browser owners are taking steps to help people's data not be so monetizable, I guess, or monetized as much. That also makes this work infinitely harder. So campaigns across the board that do this type of work or any kind of conversion campaign work, fundraising especially, their conversions are going to probably increase in cost because there are fewer data points for the online platforms that we use for advertising to use to find the people who convert. So all this to say, it's a complicated landscape. It's going to be tough.
Definitely. And my last question for you has to do with this difference between persuasion and mobilization that we've talked about on the show before. And with the Expand the Electorate project, I mean, there were two clear actions. It was getting people to complete these forms, help them get registered, and also get them to the polls. And persuasion didn't seem to be a key approach used in the project. And so I think there's, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's sort of maybe an assumption that if you're targeting and getting Black and Latinx communities registered, that they'll vote for, the preferred candidate, which in this case would be one from the Democratic Party. And so I'm curious, in designing future initiatives, is there a persuasion component of the voter formation project, or is it strictly registering and mobilizing voters in these unrepresented communities?
Nope, there is no candidate persuasion coming out of voter formation project for the foreseeable future. I view my job and my mandate and my passion is to get people of color, frankly, regardless of partisanship, to vote. As a human, would I love for these folks to turn out for progressive? Sure. But at the end of the day, what I care about the most is closing the disparity between voters of color and their white counterparts. And it is campaigns' job to convince these voters to persuade them to vote for that candidate. And that starts with treating these voters with dignity and respect to include them in your persuasion universes to begin with. I think that's the first problem, right? These voters in these communities are often taken for granted, as you said, because it's assumed they'll vote for, the candidate on the left, when if you look at Black men in particular, that's not necessarily the case. And I think the new swing voter is going to be the voter who decides to vote or not. That is going to be the difference between elections. And so if we are looking at new or lapsed voters as the folks who could possibly swing an election, I think that is a mandate for campaigns and the super PAC side to frankly start to treat these voters with the same dignity and attention, not even the same, some dignity and attention that they give these white persuadable voters. Because I don't think persuadable voters or the margins of elections are now just white people in suburbia that we've been talking about for decades. And once we start, I think, treating the entire universe of potential voters as people, maybe not the entire universe, because again, like campaigns have to make cost decisions, but continuously taking for granted and leaving out voters of color is going to be detrimental for especially the left politics, particularly when you have a Republican side that is actively courting Latinos and Black men. We cannot afford to continue to take these constituencies for granted. And I do not view it as my job to, especially the voter formation project's job, to make up for that differential. Campaigns need to show their priorities, and I think that's a good way to do it.
Definitely. Totally agree. And I mean, I think it's super interesting and super important work that you're doing. So Tatenda, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
I've just been speaking with Tatenda Musapatike. Again, she is the founder and CEO of the Voter Formation Project. Be sure to check out the links in the episode description to read more about the studies we've discussed. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Special thanks to Erica Galea from Fireside Campaigns for hooking up this episode. And remember, if you have a topic you'd like me to cover or guest you'd like to hear from on the show, let me know. You can tweet me at SMNP Podcast, mail me through socialmediaandpolitics.org. But we'll see what comes next. I'm your host, Michael Pacetta, signing off from Melba. See you next time.